camshaft front seal set. I swear I forgot my stuff again. Phew, that's a cam seal right there. I've had orders get messed up one too many times, so now when I unbox something, I'm like, God, please may be right. What is going on, ladies and gentlemen, though? Welcome back to, finally, episode 2 of Timing Belt, the movie, as I keep calling it. This right here is my 2004 PT Cruiser GT. This car is near and dear to my heart. It is my baby. I will always own it. I love this car to death. And over the past few months, I've kind of taken the time to take it apart and just do a bunch of maintenance to it, including a racing timing belt and water pump, and just redo all of that stuff in there once again to make sure we're all good to go. Another big thing that I wanted to do though is replace our valve cover and our cam seals, because I'm pretty sure that my left cam seal here on the front was leaking a little bit. It is a fairly common issue. We're on a higher mileage PT or any higher mileage 2.4 liter that cam seals might seep a little bit of oil. Not really a big deal. But since we have it apart, we're going to be throwing them in. And in this episode, we're going to be completely redoing our timing. And I'm going to kind of go a little bit more in depth, way more in depth than usual. I want to make it very clear that these videos, all of my videos, honestly, are for entertainment purposes only. I make them just because it's fun. I take you guys along with my experience. If you learn something, that's great, but we're just here hanging out, having fun, working in the shop, and tinkering around with the cars. And that's really the point of my videos. And I know a lot of people are like, well, you know, your videos aren't very educational. I'm like, I know. Waiting for a tractor to go by so that I can have good audio again. Okay, it's gone. But when we started taking this project apart, I decided to take the time to make a more in-depth two-part series on the whole timing belt thing. It's something I've gotten countless questions on. I made an old video or two on it in the past. They were really bad videos. It was back when I was like probably 17 years old, still like just starting college, and I had no clue like how to work on cars, and I just kind of sent it and took my timing belt apart, and I regretted it at the time. It was awful. It was a mess, and I had no clue what I was doing. It was my only car at the time. So now we're back at it, redoing it, doing everything the right way, cleaning up any mistakes that I made along the way, and I'm trying to make these videos longer, more in depth, and kind of show you guys the process a little bit better. So to get things started today, we're gonna go ahead and replace our cam seals. As you can see, they're already removed as of the time I'm filming this, but I filmed when I removed the gears, and I showed you guys a little bit of a backyard trick to get them out that I attempted to use. And again, all the stuff that I'm showing you, anything like torque specs that I might say, any methods of doing anything that I share with you is just how I'm doing it and what I'm gonna try to do, whether it might not be correct, you know, or not. So, you know, do this at your own risk. But without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and start putting this thing together. Let me roll the footage of when we removed our cam seals. So now that we have everything out of our way here, and upon further inspection, it looks like it could be leaking a tiny bit of oil from our cam seal right here. I think our valve cover is also leaking as well. I'm going to be replacing that. It could be partly from that, but you can see all the leaking coming down, and there's oil built up along here. I have a cheap Tractor Supply pick set, and one of the picks is like this little spiral end, as you can see, and I'm wondering if that'll be enough. Really carefully put this around, pull out. I think it's actually coming out. Okay, so since my picks literally suck and I cannot finish pulling this out, it is on its way out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a sketchy trick that I've seen people do on YouTube, and I'm actually going to drill a tiny hole, put the pick in there. You can see I have the drill bit in as far as I can. I don't recommend doing this, but we're going to give it a shot anyways, just for the heck of it. Gonna go ahead and very carefully get my pick in here. And there she comes. That trick did indeed work, but God, it was scary. Oh God. Oh, there goes our drill bit. So now that our camshaft seals are removed, we can go ahead and insert our new ones. I went ahead and cleaned up this whole area a little bit. And what I've been using for this whole project and all my projects to clean up things is what I use to clean up there. I use this Purple Power degreaser a lot. It's just what I personally recommend. It works great on like everything, and it helps break up grease and nasty stuff. And I love having these little Harbor Freight plastic brushes around. They're great to just kind of get in there, agitate everything. I sprayed some of the degreaser around, got in around here. So I cleaned everything up the best I could with that, and then I sprayed everything down with brake parts cleaner. Brake parts cleaner works really well for cleaning up greasy surfaces as well. So this seal right here is a Fel Pro Cam Seal, and they were what I'm going to personally recommend as well. The seals that I used on the convertible were a different brand. They were a red color, and they had the metal exposed on the back side. Maybe they seal a little tighter that way because the metal kind of presses on the inside and then the rubber seals the outside. But from my experience, they were very hard to insert and tap in onto the end of our cams. I do recommend these. They're full rubber on the outside, and that's going to hopefully make it just a tiny bit easier to insert. Now these do press in there, And a lot of people will use a fancy tool or tell you that you need to use a fancy tool. And honestly, it would be way easier and way less nerve-wracking if you did. But because, for one thing, I can't get my hands on one and I really want to get this job done, and two, because I just kind of want to show you guys how this works and give it a shot on camera again for you guys in a little bit of a better situation, I'm going to be tapping it on with a piece of pipe. So last time around I used a pipe that was a little bit too big, but it fit over our inner camshaft and it worked okay to tap our seals in. It was a little sketchy, but this time around I found one that's smaller and it normally wouldn't fit on, but I ground out a little bit of the outside and it's just enough that it is actually sliding on. Alright, and this is how I tapped it in on the convertible. I got it so it was just slightly recessed within here, but not too far, just a tiny bit. Hopefully the same here. So I'm going to tap that other one in off camera, and then we can go ahead and start putting our timing together. So next thing up is our water pump. I cleaned up the mating surface already, as good as it's going to get. To do that, I used the same method that I used to clean everything else up, which is a little plastic brush, shop towels, and the Purple Power, and of course the brake parts cleaner. I was really careful about it and wiped everything out and wiped out in here, inside there and everything, to make sure no debris or anything had gotten in there. And we're looking clean and good to go, so we can go ahead and throw our water pump on. Right in here I have our nice new Gates water pump. It comes with a gasket as well. But before we go ahead and throw this in the car, we need to get our gasket so that it is sealed in here and will not fall out while we install our pump. We just use a tiny bit of RTV to seal it in that position while we put it in. Unfortunately, my RTV sprung a leak here, so I'm just going to take a little finger of it and put it in a few places here on the water pump. I'm going to go ahead and start with our corner here and just carefully set this in. Alright, and after giving our red RTV a little bit of time to cure, you can go ahead and slap this thing in the car. I went ahead and got our water pump bolts in and hand tightened, but now we're going to go ahead and torque them to 100 inch-pounds. Our last bolt over here in the bottom right is kind of blocked a little bit by our tensioner for our serpentine belt. You could try to take that apart and get it out of the way so that you have just enough room that you can fit your torque wrench down in here, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a normal spanner wrench and just kind of snug it down close to the others. One last thing I forgot about though before we go ahead and throw our timing cover in is we're going to throw our tensioner pulley in. As you can see, I already have it set in here and the bolt just in a few threads. There's a hole right here in the side of the block where the first bolt threads in. There's actually only one bolt that goes into this right now, but essentially the one bolt here in our mounting plate goes through our arm right here and into a threaded hole up in here on the block. I don't even know if you can see it on the camera. It's right there. And what we're going to do to put the tensioner on is we're going to thread this bolt in a little bit, about like so that we can keep our tensioner aligned and go ahead and torque this bolt down to spec. Then once we finish that, we can go ahead and pull this bolt back out and then it will slide in the way it should and everything will be lined up when we put our plate in. And I believe this bolt torques to 45 foot-pounds, just like our tensioner pulley. There we go. And with that out of the way, we can finally go ahead and slap our timing cover in. The timing cover has 4 of these little 10mm bolts that go into it. They have this little spacer on the end, and there's also 2 of these 13mm that go way down in on the left. Here's our back timing cover, all cleaned up and power washed and looking good. So we just gotta throw it in here. Which isn't too hard to do either. You just gotta fit the power steering pump in its little hole there. You can see the pulley goes through it. It's that easy. Now we just gotta bolt it down. And a couple of minutes later, we got all of our little bolts torqued down. Just literally snug them by hand. See down here, there's our 2 13mm over there on that little wing that comes down. There's our last little 8mm. I think I said 10mm before, but they're actually 8s. There's another one right there. And then 2 right underneath where our cam gears go, right in that little recess. Before we go ahead and put our idler pulley in, I'm gonna throw our motor mount in. I completely forgot to do this before. It would be a little bit easier with our tensioner off and with our cover off, so if you think to do that before all that is put into place, it does make life a little easier, but we can do this by raising and lowering the motor and we can get it fit in here. And with our motor lowered back down, it's just enough room that I can go ahead and slide this into place. And I am going to go ahead and finger tighten a bolt in that just to keep it in place so that it doesn't move around and keep popping out on us while we're trying to raise and lower the motor. There we go. That's good enough. And one last thing before we go ahead and throw our cam gears in is we need to throw our idler pulley in. That bolt's right here up in the top, and it's usually a big 18mm bolt. Some of them have like a shallow end on the end, so they're a little hard to torque down and kind of got to be careful not to round them off. And just like our tensioner pulley, this bolt torques to 45 foot-pounds. There we go. And now, at last, we can go ahead and put our cam gears back on, which is our last step before we can go ahead and start putting our belt on and getting the car in time. As you guys probably remember, we need a special tool to go ahead and torque these bolts on and hold the cams in place while we torque the bolts, which is kind of a pain, but I'm going to show you a new tool that I made. In the last episode, I made a tool that was too thin. The metal was too thin, and it started to bend on me when I was trying to loosen our gears up, so I ended up like strap metaling it to a big breaker bar just to hold it together so I could finish the job, but I ended up building a new one that works pretty good. So basically, here is my little homemade tool that I am going to be using to torque our gears down. They make tools that are specifically for this that will probably work better and be a little bit easier to use, but you can make a little something at home if you have some metal like this. I end up using a thicker grade of angled metal. I have these two bolts. I don't know if they're 5/16 or what. There's a spider on them, actually. Get out of here. You can see I actually started to bend it a tiny bit when I was torquing our gears down before. So hopefully it holds up today, but even this almost wasn't strong enough to do the job. Just so you guys know, in case you want to make your own tool, they are 2-inch bolts, and you can see I have 2 nuts here holding it onto our metal, and they are 2.5 inches apart approximately here where I drilled holes for them, and it looks like they might be 5/16 bolts. And both of these bolts have a whopping 85 foot-pound torque spec. Woo! We got it. As you guys know, I have this beautiful Gates race timing belt that we're going to be installing on the PT GT. So this is where things get a little bit tricky, and it is a little bit of a pain, but after doing this already once recently, it shouldn't be too bad. But making sure that the motor is in time and everything takes a little bit of time. You're going to want to take your time with this. Really make sure you're checking everything over and make sure it's good to go before you carry on with the project. Last thing you want to do is get that all together just to find out that you are a tooth off, and then you got to take it all apart to fix your check engine light and your misfire. With that in mind, we're going to be really careful with this. I already got our timing mark on down here, but basically there's a timing mark here on our crank timing pulley. You can see there is a little arrow that points up on the pulley, and then there's an arrow on the side of the block, and what you're going to want to do is make sure they're lined up. And we don't want to have to turn the crank a whole rotation along with these. That's why we get our timing right about on the mark before we take the car apart, so that we know that it's close. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit of a project to figure out our timing. So as long as it's close like it is right now and it hasn't been rotated, nothing has been rotated independently like more than half of a turn, we should be good. And everything hasn't been. We just knocked that around a little bit to get it lined up, and now we can go ahead and line these up. The way that these marks work is there's a little tiny groove here in the pulley, as you can see. It's right there. It's right kind of like half of a tooth downward on one of the teeth. There's one on each side of each of the pulleys, and basically we're going to be getting them lined up on the 2 pulleys. I have part of the factory service manual printed out here that talks about the timing stuff. And you can see here, once we put everything together, we get our timing mark on down here. We're going to be getting these lined up as close as possible. When we first do it, it's going to be about a half of a tooth down on the exhaust side. So we're gonna get it lined up so that it looks pretty similar to that when we first get it on, and then we're going to turn our crank a couple times by hand, and then check everything again to make sure it's lined up. Once we turn our crank a couple of times, once our tensioner's tight, our lines should be like dead on, and then you know that you're on the right tooth. We also have to get this lined up down here. So to start things out, we're gonna go ahead and drop our beautiful belt down in here and get it around our crankshaft. It is a little bit of a tight fit, but down below here I can kind of squeeze it on. We're gonna go ahead and bring it up around our water pump, which is also a tiny bit of a tight fit, as you can see, but we're gonna wanna make sure that's pulled tight. Thankfully, our water pump and our idler pulley here all spin independently, so all we have to do right now is route it around these, and then we're going to pull it tight once we have it here on our intake cam, which, as you can see, we're putting it on right now. Now, the secret trick that works really well to help get the belt on and keep this thing in time and kind of keep everything together while we get it in time is having some of these file paper clips. This is what I used on the other car to kind of help hold the belt on while we get it all in time and get everything stretched out. See, I pulled as much of the slack out as I can by hand, and now I'm going to put that clip on, and that is going to hold it if I put it on top, and I can even turn it. And that is going to help keep the belt on and in its notches so that we can turn everything. There's still a decent amount of slack on this end of the belt, but our pulley is still tilted this way, so we could still be a tooth off that way. But we'll see here once we start turning with our little tool if we need to go another tooth. Actually, I think we're going to be right about right on right there. You guys can hopefully see I've used our tool to pull on the pulley just enough to get the slack out of it. And right now it's pretty much level horizontally, and our notch is close. I'm going to go ahead and turn our exhaust cam to our right because it is slightly off that way. what we're looking at, I think that's probably pretty close. See how our mark on our exhaust cam, which is the one on the left, slightly further down than the one on the right. That's what we're looking for right now. I'm gonna go ahead and pull our belt around, and I'm gonna put our little clip. I don't know if you can even see because my hand's in the way, but I'm gonna put our clip down a little further here on the pulley so it will hold our belt in place. I think that's about where we want it. I got everything pulled around, so now we just gotta go ahead and try to put this on the tensioner and see how it looks once we do that. You can see here on this old tensioner, once we loosen this middle bolt, this plate will spin and loosen up and tighten our tensioner. You see how that works, and it just moves ever so slightly. See how that works? But once we have our belt on here, we're going to be keeping our eye on this little thing right here, this little tab. Especially once there is tension on our belt, when we turn this plate, this is going to move, and we're going to want to tighten our plate until this little tab, the little notch in it, is lined up with our spring. The spring is this little rod that goes up into here. To start things out, I'm going to move our plate all the way to the right. Also keep in mind that our belt is a very tight fit on here. And it's also a challenge to find a good angle so you guys can see this. Hopefully you can see a little better from the bottom. Also, you won't be able to see it, but up here on the top side, I'm going to have our little tool here on our exhaust cam. I'm going to be putting just a little bit of tension on it so that we get no slack, and we're going to need all of it to get it on the tensioner for sure. There we go. Whew. That tensioner got me sweating, bro. Guys, it's like 95 degrees out today and a little bit humid. Bad day to be doing this, but gotta love it. Now we got it on the tensioner. As you can see, that was quite a bit of effort to get it on. Basically, you have to play with the plate a little bit. Usually you have to bring it all the way to the left and then slightly to the right, just a little bit, and that gives it just enough. Also pulling on this while also just like grabbing the belt with my hand and pulling back as hard as I could, and it finally popped on. So it's a bit of a chore. My phone camera with its light on actually works super well to get this on, because it's really hard to see our little tensioner spring tang thing from up here with a belt in the way. So essentially I just drop my phone camera down in, and then I can see everything. As you can see, there's our little tensioner. We're gonna line that little notch in it up with our spring. Here's our little 1/4 inch ratchet right here. That in there, we will be able to pull on this. As you can hopefully see, that little tensioner thing, that little notch is moving as I tighten it. We're basically just gonna tighten this until our notch is even with our spring, which is right about there. You can see now that's lined up. And now we're just gonna go ahead and tighten our little tensioner bolt right there while holding this, and we should be good to go. And now that we got that nut snugged down the best we could, I'm gonna go ahead and put our torque wrench here on our crank pulley and rotate it twice, and then get our marks lined up so that we can check our timing. Helps to have a breaker bar because this can be hard to turn. I'm just gonna carefully tap it. Mark is pretty much perfectly on the left side of that notch, that groove in the pulley. And as you can see, now that we got that lined up down there, our lines are pretty much dead on up top side, which means we are in time. We're perfect, which is awesome. We finally got this in here, and now we should be good to go, which is just such a relief. We can go ahead and start putting everything else back together. And to start with, we're gonna go ahead and put our crank pulley back on down here. And the step that we're gonna do first before we put our crank pulley on is we're gonna go ahead and throw our lower timing cover on. The lower timing cover goes on pretty easily. It literally just comes up in here and pops into place just like that. And then there are the 4 little 8mm screws that go in here, and then 2 up in here. Reinstalling the crank pulley, I know, is something that intimidates a lot of people, and it definitely needs to be done with caution because you can mess up your crank, and that is something that you don't want to do. Some people will literally tap this thing on with a hammer, which is a really bad idea because that puts a lot of weird forces and just a lot of bad pressure on your crankshaft. It's best to carefully drive it on with the impact for somebody like you and me, and the best way I found to do that is I found this bolt that is slightly longer than the bolt that holds this in. I wish it was a little bit longer, to be honest, but it's just long enough that we get a few more threads in there. Because if you use the normal bolt to just stick it in and impact the crank on, there's potential that you could mess up the threads, because when you first start out, you don't have a whole lot of threads into the crank. So this kind of helps out with that. And something else that I do is I throw a little bit of anti-seize here on the end of the washer just to kind of help this to spin. And I have this big like body washer on here to help it drive in a little bit more freely. They make special tools with bearings that do this job better, but this seems to be good enough to just get it on. And we're just gonna very carefully tap the impact until it's completely seated. Let's give it a little wiggle to get it started. Carefully kept driving until I felt it tighten way down. That's when I knew that we were completely in, and I just went ahead and impacted it on. And I'm not gonna worry about a torque spec. Some people will try to put the car in gear and then use a big torque wrench to torque that bolt. It has a very big torque spec, but the impact has more than enough power to snug that down. That's just what I'm gonna do, but I mean, if you wanna be careful, I would recommend trying to get a torque spec and get that torqued correctly. That has worked good enough for me the past few times I've done the job. And then from here, I will usually go ahead and put our serpentine belts on, which I'm gonna go ahead and wait on because I'm gonna be getting a new AC compressor hopefully for this thing soon. Now that we got our crank pulley all situated, we can go ahead and reinstall our motor mount plate, which shouldn't be too hard to do now. Personally, I like to leave this middle motor mount unbolted until the plate is in there. I think it makes it a little easier to get the plate in and out. That's why I unbolted it first. I know it's probably not necessary. I've heard a lot of people say that they got the plate in and out no problem without that being unbolted, but I just leave it unbolted just so that there's a little play there. It's honestly pretty simple. With our motor all the way jacked up, we just go ahead and slowly and carefully lower this plate in here, trying not to like hit our belt a bunch or anything. Alright guys, she's finally started. So a mistake I just made that made putting the plate in a little bit harder is I did put our crank pulley on first, and what was happening was the crank pulley was actually touching on our motor mount, catching just a tiny bit, and I thought the motor was jacked up all the way, but it wasn't. So I was like, why am I struggling to get this in when the motor won't go up? But when I jacked a little bit harder, it broke free. It was just barely touching, and then it kept going up, and I was able to do that. Thankfully, it didn't damage like the edge of the crank or anything in the motor mount. But so it's probably best to do the crank pulley last, just so that it's out of the way, and it makes this job a little bit easier to do first. So I'm gonna make a note about that in a summary as well. And yet again, these bolts torque to 45 foot-pounds. And with our motor lowered back down, I was able to put our last bolt in. I found one laying around. That would be the right thread and about the same length. Now that we have everything else in, our last thing is we can finally go ahead and put all the bolts in our motor mount. I'm just going to be snugging them down by hand, not using a torque spec because it's so tight in there, it's kind of hard to get a torque wrench in there anyways. After a while of wrenching on those rusty bolts, we finally got them in and torqued down nice and tight by hand, which should be good enough. Now we go ahead and put our main motor mount bolt in, and once that is in, the motor will be supporting itself finally. So in order to do that, first you have to raise and lower the motor so that the hole is in position. So you can hopefully see there are two little tabs there on the mounting plate that are going to be lining up, and I already have mine lined up just by chance, but usually it's a little bit of work to get them lined up. You have to raise up or lower down accordingly, and those will usually catch on the mount there. You kind of have to keep jacking and putting pressure up until they pop up into place, and once we get our bolt in and tightened down, those will be seated. Yeah, I think that's going to thread. And this bolt torques to 87 foot-pounds. It's a pretty good little torque spec. Freshly painted motor mount bracket right here. You guys remember from when we took it apart, there's two studs there that this is going to fit on. And then there's one bolt in the front that's going to hold it as well. All right, I just went ahead and hand torqued down those bolts really quick. I don't have a torque spec for them, but I just cranked them down by hand good enough. I don't always use torque specs. I use them on more like, you know, important stuff that you really need a torque spec for to, you know, feel secure about installing it. I don't always worry about torque specs. I know a lot of people will be like, hey, who cares about torque specs? Just do it by feel. Other people say, you know, you have to go by the book, but I'm kind of a little bit of both, I guess. Got those bolts snug down, and I just set our little race motor mount in here just to see how everything looks. I don't have our cover on, and I should probably put that on if I'm going to put it on. Either way, this is where we're going to start winding down this episode because that is all of the primary stuff that you have to do for the timing. The only thing I didn't talk about is reinstalling the power steering pump, which, you know, is pretty straightforward. You have those 3 bolts that I talked about before. I'll mention these things in the summary, but that stuff and like our front end and everything, our radiator and stuff, I'm not going to be putting that in quite yet because I have more work I'm doing on this car. Primary timing stuff is completely done, which I'm so excited for because that means I get to run this car again. Probably tomorrow we're going to be putting the turbo in. I was hoping to get it done by the end of today, but that's not going to happen. Tomorrow I'm going to be putting the turbo in and hopefully firing it up and doing some big things at last. I also have to throw a new lower intake manifold gasket in and stuff like that. So probably the last video I'm going to make like this. You know, I just, like I always say, I take you guys along with me in my projects, and I don't try to make them like any sort of DIY or I guess I don't try to make them helpful, even though I guess they could be helpful. They're made for entertainment purposes only, and these videos are as well, but just a little bit more in depth. So I hope you enjoyed, and maybe you were able to learn something that would help you out if you're in the same situation. But we got it all together, and I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and roll out a little end of the video summary for those of you who are trying to do this job. Maybe it'll help you out.
Alright, so first things first, if you are going to be changing your cam seals out, that needs to be done first after everything is stripped down. The trick that I used to do that was I drilled a tiny hole very carefully in the cam seal and used a small pick to pull it out. They make special tools that do it that are slightly less sketchy, but this method does work. It did work for me. For tapping the seals back in, I used a piece of PVC pipe that just barely fit over the end of the cam. And there's a few different methods you could use to do that too, but that worked for me. You just have to be extremely careful to pound it in straight and evenly and not recess it too far. From there, the first step with getting the timing put back together is the water pump. I went ahead and cleaned up the gasket mating surface really good on the side of the motor. Went ahead and put our gasket in our water pump with just a tiny bit of gasket maker, and then went ahead and torqued that in there to spec. And those all torqued to 100 inch-pounds according to the manual. After we do the water pump, I made this mistake, and it's okay if you do make this mistake, but it's a little easier if you go ahead and throw the motor mount in right now, the middle motor mount. I just finger tightened the bolt for the time being. From there, we can go ahead and install our tensioner, which is pretty easy to do. The top right bolt in our motor mount plate actually goes through the tensioner and holds it in place. So we're going to use the one bolt on the left of the tensioner, get that in finger tight, and then go ahead and put the other bolt in just a few threads to keep the tensioner lined up while we go ahead and torque the bolt down to 45 foot-pounds. Then we go ahead and pull the bolt back out, put it in our plate, and reinstall it later. From there, we can go ahead and finally throw in our back timing cover, which is really easy, just a few 10mm bolts and two 13mm to snug down. That in, we can go ahead and throw our idler pulley in, which simply just threads in and torques to 45 foot-pounds, just like the tensioner bolt. And once our idler's in, we can go ahead and throw our cam gears back on, which is fairly easy if you have a decent little tool. Once the bolts are finger tightened, hold on to the cam gears with your tool, and I torqued them to about 85 foot-pounds. From there, we are completely ready to start installing our belt. So I went ahead and got our crank right on the top dead center mark, and it is key that we get the motor close to being in time before we take it apart and make sure that nothing gets rotated like more than a half of a turn, because then that causes a big mess trying to get everything back in time. But thankfully, we took care of that ahead. All I had to do was get that top dead center mark lined up, throw our belt on the crank, and then route it up around our water pump and idler pulley, and then around our intake cam. And once I got it around our intake cam, I used a little paper clip to hold it on from the top. And I just basically had to kind of eyeball it to get it so our line would be fairly close to being lined up once we got the slack out. And then from there, I went ahead and pulled it around our exhaust cam, used a paper clip on that as well. Sometimes you have to eyeball it and try a couple times to make sure that your marks are going to be, you know, within a half a tooth when you finally get it on the tensioner, pulling the slack and everything, you know, just kind of got to mess with it, fiddle with it until you're sure that it's on the right tooth. Once it's on the tensioner, then we can verify that. But in order to get it on the tensioner, of course, that plate has to loosen. Pull it all the way to the right to loosen it, and then sometimes a little bit of a turn to the left is required to finally slip the belt on, while also pulling on the exhaust cam slightly with our tool to get rid of any slack in the belt. And with a good pull, the belt will finally pop on the tensioner. From there, we can go ahead and tighten the tensioner by moving the plate with our little 1/4" ratchet until our little tab pops up into place over our spring and lines up with the spring tang. And then we can go ahead and tighten the bolt in the middle, snug that down, and then we can go ahead and turn the belt from the crank at least 2 times. That'll get any last little bit of slack out of the belt, and then we can go ahead and align our top dead center mark up again down on the crank. Verify that our timing is right on up on our cam gears, and if it is, then we're good to go. There we go ahead and bolt our motor mount plate back in, which is just the 3 volts that torque to 45 foot-pounds. Usually that requires jacking the motor up as high as possible. And there we can go ahead and lower our motor back down and throw our lower timing cover on, which is just 4 little 8mm screws. And then we can go ahead and start installing our crank sprocket, which is a pressed on sprocket. So it is a little bit of a challenge, but what I did, as I showed earlier in the video, I found a bolt that was slightly longer than the bolt that holds it in normally. Just take the current bolt to any hardware store or automotive parts store. They should have something that's a little longer for you. I used a washer and some NECs to make it spin in a little better, and I used the impact to start seating the pulley. That worked okay for me. There's a few different methods that a lot of people use, but that worked, and that's what I have used in the past. You can debate on whether it's a good or bad idea to impact that on, but oh well. With a crank bearing sprocket back on, we can go ahead and install our power steering pump, which is something I didn't do in this video. It's just those 3 bolts normally. Then we can go ahead and throw our serpentine belts back on. Once that is all together, we can finally put our middle motor mount in, thread the bolt in, and crank it down to 85 foot-pounds. Then we can reinstall our lower and upper mounts and our upper mount plate, and then from there we can reinstall our ground wire, our AC lines, whatever else was in the way. I can't remember, but that's pretty much the process to get this installed. I hope the summary was helpful. That's just literally the whole job off the top of my head. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it could be of help.
It's a bit by flow.